and De Beers' mines are in South Africa, Botswana, and Namibia mainly. So we have quite a wide global footprint, and obviously, given the countries where we operate, a lot of interest in corruption and in transparency. And I'm very pleased to be able to join this webinar today to talk a little bit about that.
Thanks, Peter. Ginu?
Yes, thank you. Thank you also for inviting us to join you, Rocio. So I'm Ginu Kula. I'm a senior economist at Norges Bank Investment Management. Norges Bank manages the sovereign wealth fund of Norway. A little bit of background on the fund. The fund is currently valued at over $1 trillion, and about 70% of that is invested in equities, meaning that we own a tiny slice of around 9,000 companies. Very broad, because those 9,000 companies are across all sectors and 70 countries. So you can imagine with that kind of portfolio, we really need very high quality information about the companies that we own. I should also just say we are a financial investor, which means that our objective is to maximize long-term returns with moderate risk. But we're also a responsible investor. And I shouldn't say but, I should say and. We are a financial investor and we are a responsible investor, because really we think of responsible investment as our investment strategy. It really is common sense for us that we need to know, we want to know what companies' activities are and how they impact the environment, society around them, because that behavior affects their profitability, and that means it affects our returns as a fund. So it's information for us as we make our investment decisions.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much to both. So my first question again is to both of you, and perhaps we can start with Ginu. So where do you see the links between anti-corruption, transparency, and other sustainability factors?
Sure. So I think it's useful for us to think about anti-corruption as fitting into the lens of good governance. And again, as a long-term investor thinking about maximizing long-term returns, what we're really saying is that we want to invest in high-quality companies. And a good company, a high-quality company, takes governance seriously. In some ways, a corruption scandal is a lagging indicator. It's already too late if a company has shown corruption risk. And for us, again, I'd like to bring an investor's perspective to bear. For us, it's really obvious why corruption matter, because corruption risks puts our shareholder risk our shareholder value at risk. It exposes companies to financial and reputational risks, but also to underlying legal, operational, and governance risk. And so that's really how we see the anti-corruption agenda and why it matters when we're looking at the companies that we own.
Thank you. Peter, for you, what are these links?
Yeah, so the whole mining industry rests on trust because of the position it plays in the economies where we operate. So Botswana diamond mining is really the main industry in the country, and has brought the country from extremely modest economic position to actually quite a prominent position in Africa, at least on a per capita basis. Similarly, mining is a very big industry in Chile, and not a small industry by any means in Brazil and South Africa, and in Australia, of course. And in order to maintain that kind of position over a very long period of time, because mining assets are typically very long life assets, you need to build the trust with the host governments, with the communities, obviously also with your own employees, who want to feel they're working in a sustainable organization that plays a responsible part in the economies and societies in which it operates. And the transparency comes in because I would say increasingly over time, trust is impossible without transparency. So we we've been through the kind of revolution from trust me to show me. And I think today we wouldn't even accept that people say just trust me. The society's changed so much in that respect, and I think any company, but especially in mining, makes a mistake if it doesn't embrace transparency as something which is, maybe difficult, maybe quite onerous, by the way, and we can talk about that later, perhaps. But how do you provide that transparency in a reliable way? But we have to embrace it, because that's part of gaining and maintaining that trust. And so, actually, transparency is our friend in a funny kind of way. So, and if we're not embracing it, then we're a little bit missing the point, because the transparency changes from year to year, and you can't, when new requests come in, you can't say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to show you stuff from 5 years ago because 5 years ago you didn't ask me. That's not a plausible answer. We need to be able to maintain a secure basis to provide transparency in the future.
Thanks, Peter. And I think that this takes me very nicely to my question to Ginu now. So when we did Open Business, we were, of course, trying to understand what are investors asking from companies. So I think, and I think you are very transparent around that. You have your requirements, your expectations, and they are clearly displayed in your website. But if you can perhaps share with the audience, what are Norges' expectations around ABC disclosures? And also, why are these important? And finally, how do you engage with companies? How do you really make sure they understand your expectations?
Yes, great question. So just for background, for those who aren't, again, familiar with Norges Bank and how we get the information on anti-corruption, we've been raising anti-corruption as a theme with the companies that we own since 2015. And as you mentioned, Rocio, we also have published an expectations document. The purpose of that expectations document is to be as clear as we can be of what we want to hear and understand from companies. And maybe Peter can speak to this. There are, of course, competing demands of companies on what they need to disclose. And so we're very clear on what we want to see from a company in order to understand the risks. Again, for us, transparency is really about pricing risks. Without that information, we don't know where the opportunities are. We also don't know what the risks are to our investments. The three main components of our expectations and just at a very high level of what we expect from companies, we want to understand what the board's role is in overseeing anti-corruption policy. B, we want to understand that a company has an anti-corruption policy, but more than that, we want to understand how that policy is actually put to practice. What are the procedures underlying that policy? How does it cascade down business lines? Importantly, how does it affect third parties and other sources of risk? We want to understand how companies actually assess that risk, measure that risk. And finally, and I think this is really just in general, the hardest bit of disclosure and information gathering is often companies do have an anti-corruption program in place. It's hard to find a company that doesn't have any anti-corruption policy. What is really hard to find are companies that measure the effectiveness of those programs. And honestly, if we can't see how a company is measuring the effectiveness of their programs, it's really hard for us to know, but it must also be hard for the companies to know whether their programs are actually reducing corruption. And I think that's the bit of data that we still have quite a long ways to go on.
Thanks very much. I think this is very interesting also because part of in Open Business, in our report, we looked, of course, into what are the requirements from investors, but I think we are seeing that business case is coming from all angles. So customers are expecting companies to be transparent, employees engage more with companies that are transparent. And then we have also the reputation as a driver and maximizing competitive advantage. So there are different drivers towards transparency. And in terms of, if we deep dive into some of the areas of transparency, I'd like to perhaps ask you, Peter, we know that Anglo-American has been doing country-by-country reporting for a while now. In particularly, you have been disclosing disclosing your taxes on an annual basis, and I think it's from 2018 or 19 that you started. So I'd like to understand why has Anglo American chosen to do this, and how have you found that increasing transparency in this area has helped your organization?
So, I mean, why have we done it? It really comes back to what I was saying earlier about trust, and about building these relationships with the people in the countries where we operate. I think it's important for people to know, but because the tax take is so big from an extractive industry like mining, it's important for people to know how much. Of course, as much as possible, we try to be transparent about what taxes we're paying where, because of course, in some of these countries, there's an issue of trust within the country, of local people towards central government and so on, and we you know, to some degree we have a role in helping building that. I wouldn't say that's our task, but that's a good byproduct of the work that we're doing. So that's why we think it's so important, and we, you know, we believe it's important for the industry as well, which is why we're very active in the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which really promotes this type of transparency disclosure across the extractive industries, and where we have, I think it's 54 countries now signed up to that, because I mean, in order to build trust, everybody really needs to take part. Trust is a mutual thing, so it's not enough for one company to say, hey, you know, I'm doing all these things, you should trust me. That people are inherently suspicious about that. I think if you, and perhaps rightly so, I think if you want to build a trust, it needs to be a joint thing with many different parties.
Thanks, Peter. So that takes me to the final question, but I think going back to the question that we asked to the attendees today, we wanted to know their opinion on whether they think that companies are doing enough to meet stakeholder demands related to anti-corruption transparency. So 76% said no. And then 17% say don't know, and 5% say yes. So it seems that we have a long way to go. So loads of work from the investor side, the companies and civil society to try to encourage companies to disclose more information around corruption risks and to reduce corruption risks. So this response prompted my curiosity on, and this is something that I mentioned at the beginning in my introduction, why most investors and companies seem to be more focused on environmental and social disclosures. Why are anti-corruption disclosures lagging? So perhaps I'd love to know your opinion, Gino, if perhaps you can start, and then perhaps Peter could follow up. Thank you.
Sure. Let me just start by saying I agree with the observation that there has been an increasing focus on an environment and social disclosures. I think that is true from the investment side and civil society, and also companies and what they're trying to disclose. In my mind, one reason at least that there is an increased focus on both environmental and social disclosures is that they're starting from a very low base. So if we think about the quality and quantity of disclosure on either of those topics, and of course those topics are labels for even larger, broader topics, whether it's climate, water management, biodiversity, anti-corruption, social tax can fall under social human rights. It just strikes me that where disclosure needs to go on any of those topics is really at early stages of maturity, and in part why there's been focus. Having said that, it's not clear to me that the focus on either environmental or social disclosures comes at the expense of anti-corruption. And the reason I say that is, again, going back to some of my original comments, I really think that we can think about anti-corruption as fitting quite neatly into this box of governance. Like high quality governance should go hand in hand with sound policies on anti-corruption and reducing future risks of corruption. In which case, for us as an investor, and I think this is probably true for most investors, governance is really foundational. Without good governance, it is not obvious that you are going to be a company that has solid long-term financial returns. It may mean short-term returns, but long-term returns I think are much more uncertain. So I'll stop there. But I guess my one last point that I think is worth bringing to bear is when we're talking about, again, focus on disclosure, there should be, even if disclosure and anti-corruption in some ways has come further along in terms of what to ask. I think there's certainly agreement amongst us and perhaps with this audience that there's still a long way to go. I've already mentioned that understanding the effectiveness of anti-corruption programs is really relevant here. I would say that the other real challenge with anti-corruption, and Rocio, I know that the Transparency International is doing quite a lot of work around this, is how do you measure the unmeasurable? When we're talking about cultures of integrity or even tone from the top, when we're talking about staff attitudes and behavior and their willingness and ability to report bribery or fraud or other instances of corruption, even before they come to a head. How do we measure that? When we're asking for measurements of effectiveness, it's a challenge to get quantitative indicators, and we recognize that it's challenging, and we also recognize that companies are attempting to do this. And so we want to be able to support those efforts and be as precise as possible in terms of what we're looking for in terms of that data.
Thanks very much, Ginu. Peter, what is your opinion about this dilemma? Why are companies focusing more on disclosing information in relation to environmental and human rights risks? And why are the anti-corruption disclosures lagging?
Yeah, I suppose, like Juno, I don't know that they're really lagging. I think we start certainly in my professional experience, which goes back to pharmaceuticals and before that in oil and gas. I think we were probably focused on corruption, particularly financial related corruption, earlier than really, honestly, environmental and social things kind of became preeminent in people's minds. I think it is true that right now, and I'd echo Juno there, right now that environmental and social is very much at the forefront of people's minds, and that's understandable given that we're going through a terrible pandemic with enormous social consequences, and which raises very big question marks around our environmental stewardship. And of course we have climate change, which would be even more prominent if we hadn't had the pandemic. So these are understandably at the front of people's minds. I think you know, at a company level and within our operations, it's actually very difficult to separate these three topics. Partly because I think anyway we need to manage things in an integrated fashion. But if you just take water as an example, you know, water management is an environmental question, because mining requires a lot of water, so we're obviously drawing from from maybe scarce water resources, could have an impact on vegetation, but clearly can also have an impact on the societies around us, because we may be drawing water that people need for domestic use, for other industries, for agriculture, of course. And you know, where there is scarcity, there is also corruption. So it's not that these sort of neat categories don't really apply in real operations in the field. And a challenge for us is really, how do we, with a global investor and stakeholder perspective, how do we translate that through our programs very consistently through the company down into the local operations in a way that it, you know, feeds down and feeds up at the same time? That's actually really quite hard. But you know, and you know, I'd love to get get further into discussion about how do we get leading or lagging indicators, but even within the company, to be able to manage these things, you need data, you need transparency, and because without it, of course, you don't really know whether you can depend on the information you're receiving. So I think the one really feeds into the other in the end, Rocio.
I agree. In fact, one of the points we tend to make is that underpinning environmental negative impacts and human rights impact there, in many occasions, corrupt behaviors. So I think it's important that all the people that we work in this space, either from the investor side, companies, or civil society, we understand that those three factors, ESG, are linked. So I think we have time for one more question, maybe. And I'd like to ask you about the role of regulation. So how can regulation, or if regulation, help disclosures? What is your opinion on that? So, I mean, perhaps we can start this time with Peter, as we started before with Gino. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I'll try to be brief. I mean, regulation in this area is actually quite helpful because we then know what we're aiming at in terms of providing information. And one thing is difficult at the moment is that in the ESG area, there are kind of competing norms for kind of what KPIs should look like, what we should be disclosing on, competing even expectations about what does good look like, and I think that's probably a good time for the regulators to step up a bit. And play a kind of honest broker role and what's really needed. But it's what we see the regulation in this area as generally being helpful.
Thank you. What is your opinion, Gino?
It's very hard to disagree with that. So, of course, regulation matters deeply and profoundly. It matters because it requires companies to provide information that they may not otherwise provide. And for all the reasons that Peter mentioned, as an investor, it is hard, not only because companies struggle with competing demands on what to disclose, but it's hard for us to look at different types of disclosure and make sense of it when it's not comparable. So in that way, regulation it helps with comparability. And hopefully it also helps with relevance. But I would say we can't wait for regulation to change disclosure. And so in the absence of regulation that does require better or more disclosure, what can companies do? And we as a fund support the GRI standards, including the GRI standard, both on tax, which is related to CBCR, and also on anti-corruption. And at least in the interim, as we see more companies adopting the GRI standard, we're getting some of the benefits of that kind of standardized disclosure, what is relevant and also what is comparable.
Thanks very much. We have 1 minute to go, and I'd like to perhaps wrap up with some words about the report we have done. We have mentioned today, well, the report that we launched 1 year ago, in which we have touched upon today anti-corruption transparency, when Gino mentioned what are the expectations from the investor perspective. We also touch upon country-by-country reporting, but in open business, we also looked into 3 other areas. We looked into beneficial ownership transparency, and mainly we are asking companies to publicly disclose information on their beneficial owners and demand this information from their counterpart, and also from governments to adopt data standards for ownership disclosure. This is something that we have been campaigning for, and we are. And we also, in open business, ask for publicly disclosures on all fully consolidated subsidiaries and non-fully consolidated holdings. And we want companies to state publicly that they will not work with business that operate or which operates with deliberately opaque structures. And last but not least, we call on companies to disclose information on the way they engage in political activities. So information in relation to political donations, lobbying, revolving doors. It is important to do responsible lobbying and for stakeholders to understand what companies are lobbying on. So as we are running out of time, I would like to thank our speakers today for providing us very interesting insights, and finally make an announcement. So Gino mentioned today how relevant is for companies to measure the effectiveness of their approach to anti-corruption. And this is the subject matter of our next study that we will be launching at the beginning of May. So the name is Make It Count. So watch out this space, because it's almost ready to go. And I like to finish up by saying that if any of the attendees would like to engage with us, with Transparency International UK or the Business Integrity team, please send us an email, call us. Would love to work with you on to try to improve corporate behavior and transparency in anti-corruption. Thanks very much to my speakers and attendees, and hope to continue this discussion soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.